Welcome back, everyone, to Political Science 101, American Government and Politics at Simmons College. I want to thank you all who have commented on the previous videos on YouTube, that you watch the videos, and that's how you get your participation grade and your attendance grade for this semester. Don't forget to comment below this video to let me know that you watched it. That's how you get your attendance grade, I should say. And participation is determined on questions, critiques, comments, and input that you have about the lectures or about the reading material in the textbook. Before I get into the new material today, I want to address a comment that one of you made on YouTube, and it was a comment and a question. It was a very, very good question. That question had to do with the slave population of the United States at the time, late 1700s, when the United States Constitution was enacted, was ratified, and became the ultimate supreme law of the United States. On Monday, I described the Three-Fifths Compromise, which was a very important part of the founding of this country, but it also highlighted the hypocrisy, the lack of common sense that went into laying the groundwork for the type of representative government we have in this country. So, as a refresher, that Three-Fifths Compromise was one in which Congress, it was the Constitutional Convention, when they were drafting the Constitution, they decided that to determine the population of any given state, and therefore determine how many votes that state gets in the House of Representatives, they were going to count the total population of white people, or I should say free people in the state, and add to that number 3/5 of any person held in bondage, any slave in that state, because as you all know, the late 1700s was a time in which people of African descent were held as chattel slavery. What do I mean by chattel? I mean property. I mean property that can be bought and sold and traded. There has been slavery throughout the history of the world, but American slavery was the most brutal, the most unforgivable form of slavery the world has ever seen. And that was going on in this country in the late 1700s, when the Constitution became the law of the land. And some parts of the Constitution, in fact, if you take nothing else away from this semester, remember this: there were certain pieces of the Constitution that laid the groundwork for equality. We're not there yet, clearly. We're still not at a point in this country where all people are treated the same, regardless of gender, race, national origin, religion, ethnicity, sexuality. We're still not there. But there are pieces of the Constitution that we can use today to help move us towards equality. But there were also some pieces that were inherently hypocritical, like the Three-Fifths Compromise. One of you in this class asked me on YouTube, how can you count 3/5 of a person or 3/5 of the slave population of any given state back then in the census, in the official population of the state, but you don't give those people the right to vote? Great question. Great question. And that is part and parcel of America's original sin. The original sin. Think about I'm making a Bible analogy here, the analogy to Adam and Eve and the original sin of the forbidden fruit. In the origins of the United States, the original sin was slavery. This country has the pieces in place to be a great nation, and it always has those pieces in place, but hasn't quite gotten there because when our nation came into being, the founders of this nation allowed slavery to persist. In the British colonies, there was slavery. There was chattel slavery. People of African descent were involuntarily put into bondage and forced to work against their will, and then treated as property. And when they made the Constitution that became the supreme law of the land, instead of outlawing slavery, which would have dissolved the Constitutional Convention, the southern states would have walked out, including Virginia. Without Virginia, there would be no United States back then. They allowed it to persist. They allowed slavery to persist. And as you probably know, that culminated in the bloodiest American war. There have been bloodier wars in history, but no war has been more costly to the people, black and white, of the United States than the American Civil War. But we'll talk more about that later in class. For now, to answer your classmate's question directly, there is no logical way to explain the fact that slaves in those southern states in the late 1700s did not have legal rights. They certainly did not have the right to vote. But 3/5 of the slave population was counted in order to increase the votes in the House of Representatives for those slave-holding states. Later in class, we'll talk about the Civil Rights Movement, and even before that, we'll talk about some United States Supreme Court decisions that directly address this question of whether or not slaves, people held in bondage, had any rights under the Constitution. If you want to get a head start on that, and also if you haven't read it before and you want to get fairly angry and frustrated, read Dred Scott versus Sanford. It is an opinion of the United States Supreme Court, and we'll talk about that branch of government, the judicial branch, next week, this coming Monday, 31st of August. But that is the worst opinion in the history of the United States Supreme Court, ethically, morally, and practically, the worst. And it declared legally that slaves had no rights under the law. It's one of the main reasons that the northern states fought the Civil War and won the Civil War to free slaves. Sort of freed the slaves. We'll talk more about that later. But for now, what you need to know is that the Constitution did originally contain the 3/5 compromise, and that the idea that 3/5 of the slave population of the South would be counted when it came to how many votes in Congress those states received cannot be reconciled with the fact that those people did not have a right to vote. It is undemocratic. It is not representative of the people living in this country. And the only way the delegates to the Constitutional Convention could have possibly arrived at that compromise is if they accepted that people of African descent were not the same kind of people as the white people who ran this country. That is one of the horrible truths of American history. It is illogical, it is irrational, it is amoral, and I am not a pastor, but I am a Christian, and I'll tell you that's unchristian. It's the idea of treating people so unequally under the law is abhorrent to anyone with a conscience today, but it was in the original language of the Constitution. So, in other words, I can't try to rationalize it and it makes sense to you, but I can tell you that's what happened. And it's because of the level of inequality between people of European descent in the early days of the United States and people of African descent. If you wanted to say to that there still exists a level of inequality between people of European descent and people of African descent in this country, I would agree. It's different. The dynamic has changed, but of course there's still inequality between those two populations. So, moving on to the topic of today's lecture, the executive branch. And I'll keep this short, and I'll summarize it, and I encourage you to read Article 2 of the Constitution. I also encourage you to read the assigned reading in the textbook for this several week period of class. I also encourage you to pay attention to the news, because we're in almost unprecedented times, certainly rare times when it comes to the power of the executive branch in this country. We're living through very interesting times when it comes to the power of the executive branch, what the executive branch can and cannot do. The Constitution says that the executive branch of government is a few things. It is the branch that is run by the president. The president of the United States is the chief executive of the federal government. What can he or she, well, so far they've all been men, but what can that person do as president? Perhaps their most relevant power when it comes to making laws that govern all of us is their ability to approve or disapprove statutes passed by Congress. When Congress passes a bill, as I said on Monday, and it goes to the president's desk for the president to sign or veto, the president either signs the law or the president vetoes it and sends it back to Congress. That's number one. Number two, and I'm ranking these in my own personal but well-founded order of importance. Number two, the president is commander-in-chief of the military. That's something that the meaning of that has changed very much in the last 200 plus years. When the Constitution was passed, although George Washington was not officially president yet, the idea was that he would be the president, and he was this great commanding general with all this military success. So if he ever needed to step in and take over the military in time of war, he had the experience to do that. But also, Congress knew what they were doing. The Constitutional Convention knew what they were doing, and they gave Congress the power to declare war, but the president the power to command the military. So only Congress can declare war, only the president can command the military. What does that mean? For the first 170, 180 years of this country's history, it really meant that if this country wanted to put the full strength of its military behind some conflict and fight a foreign nation, Congress had to declare war and also allocate money to fight the war, and the president had to command the military in that war effort. That has changed over the years. The biggest turning point would be Vietnam, the Vietnam War, which Congress never declared war, but I'd be surprised if you've never heard it referred to as a war. It was a time when several presidents, 5 presidents actually, over time, they escalated American military involvement until, before you know it, we're at war. That's not how it's written in the Constitution, but it is a power the president has. Should the president have that power? I don't know, but that's what happened in Vietnam. Since then, there have been a few major conflicts. The Gulf War in the 1990s. The war in Afghanistan that started in the early 2000s. The Iraq War, or Second Iraq War, that began in, I believe it was 2003. Those are all military conflicts that Congress did not declare war, but the president sent troops, American troops, to fight a war. The president has a lot of power when it comes to the military. Congress has to allocate funding for the military, but within that budget allocated by Congress, the president can pretty much do whatever he wants until it comes time to pass a new budget every year, and that's when Congress can rein in the president's power. But until that time comes, the president can do pretty much whatever he wants. Once again, I'm not saying that's right. I'm not saying that's exactly what the Constitution says. I'm saying that is how it is in the United States today. I mean, if we woke up tomorrow and learned that the president had ordered troops into pretty much anywhere, it would not be unconstitutional for the president to do that. It would be politically complicated. It would probably cause the United States, a lot of diplomatic issues, but it would not be contrary to the Constitution. However, at some point, Congress would have to allocate funding and pass a budget that included military funding. So that's the check and the balance between the executive branch and the legislative branch. That's one example of it, I should say. So, the president signs legislation. The president is commander-in-chief of the United States military. And the president represents the United States in all diplomatic matters. I should say the executive branch. The president officially is what we call the head of state. That means it's the person who is the individual who officially represents the United States when we're dealing with foreign countries. That's a big one. So those are the real main responsibilities of the president. Those are the big ones, but there are some other things that are in the Constitution that are often left out of kind of the media discussion of the presidency, and they're certainly left out of the discussion of the election years like this one. When two candidates are debating back and forth about who's going to be the better president. And those are the things that actually impact our day-to-day lives more. Unless you or one of your members of your family happen to be in the armed services, the commander-in-chief power does not affect your daily life that much. The president signs and vetoes legislation all the time. Does that really affect your daily life? Probably not. Maybe every few years there'll be one piece of legislation that does, but overall, probably not. The president can also issue executive orders. Executive orders are a pretty big deal. How big a deal? Not as big a deal as the statute, not nearly as big a deal as the Constitution, but somewhere below that. Executive orders have the force and authority of law. And the president is the chief law enforcement officer of the United States. The Department of Justice, that's the FBI. There's a lot of other agencies that deal with law enforcement at the federal level. The president is in charge of enforcing those things. And this is a good place for both a segue and an end to this week's lecture, because on Monday, this coming Monday, I'm going to talk about the judicial branch, and I'm going to talk about the authority of different types of laws. I've talked about the powers of Congress, the powers of the president. All throughout that, I keep talking about how the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. It is the law by which all other laws are judged. If a statute violates the Constitution, it's no longer a law. Who gets to decide that? The judicial branch, the third and final branch of federal government. And we'll talk about that Monday. We'll also talk about executive orders issued by the president and what their impact is. What does an executive order mean to you and me? What does that mean in context of federal law? We'll talk about that on Monday. In the meantime, please do not forget to comment below that you watched this video. And I thank you all so much for watching this. I thank you for being excellent students in this unusual semester. But we're going to make it work, and I'm going to make sure that you learn the material you need to learn about American government and politics. Thank you all so much for following along, and I'll talk to y'all on Monday.